works with me. We'll move fast. To complement the previous speakers, the key thing that we'd like to highlight with respect to the different revolutions is that the first one, focusing on STEM, was a step change in power and production, and the human element was humans as labor. The second industrial revolution, focusing on science and production, assembly lines, mass production, standardization, had the human positioned as a consumer. The third industrial revolution, focusing on information, technology, and computation, focused on human beings as machines. The fourth industrial revolution, which we're seeing as convergence and re-emergence, is challenging because we're seeing human beings as hybrids, and this includes such things as cyborgs. Okay. This will be challenging. Okay. The second key message in this regard is that the fourth industrial revolution matters just in terms of the volume of business that's being created. I'm trying to go back. This will be quite... And what we have seen... Please bear with me. I need help from the technical team, please. I beg your pardon for that. So we're going to be dual. We'll use a manual approach. Yes, please proceed. Next slide. You have to go 3 slides forward. It's a slide referencing the value being created over the past 10 years. Economies, 7 digital companies are responsible for 80% of the value that's been created in the last 10 years. The other reason why the fourth industrial revolution matters, next slide, yes, is that we need to think about it from a holistic point of view. One, in terms of inclusive mental model, bringing together a variety of transformative changes due to the technologies that depend on the same fundamental digital infrastructure. 2, the impact on society. Technologies are changing the social fabric and our relationships to each other. 3 is emerging industrial models. The pairing of technologies is creating new business models and organizational frameworks. And 4, as a systemic governance challenge, all these technologies are calling for new, agile policy frameworks. Next slide. The other key issue to highlight about this fourth industrial revolution is that it is not entirely new in terms of innovation. What we're actually seeing is a combination of old and new technologies. They call it recombinant innovation. For example, robots conducting tasks that were previously done by humans. It's also clear that we're at an inflection point, and as highlighted by other speakers, the technologies are changing rapidly. Next slide. The other key aspect of concern is that the fourth industrial revolution matters because it creates and amplifies risks, and these risks play off against each other. Next slide. Furthermore, with respect to risk perceptions over the past 10 years or so, what we're seeing increasingly is that the global scope and broad societal impact due to these systemic effects calls for collaboration globally in respect to investments, organizational strategies, productivity, consumption, as well as human behavior. Next slide. So this is the second part, the view from organizations. We'll try to speed it up. Next slide. So it's not just governance that is challenged. We also have leaders in the private sector as well, thinking about the questions that you see up there. What will my sector look like? What will interaction with customs and citizens look like in the future? How do I think about my industry digital direction when it is a broader ecosystem? How will boundaries change? How much should I disrupt myself? Should we forget about, please go back one slide. Should we forget our history? So how do we build on the past? And then how do we balance clear direction with agile innovation? You need to build on the past with respect to a roadmap that delivers scale, but lacks speed and flexibility. But at the same time, you need an agile approach that delivers speed but lacks scale. How do you balance this? Next slide. So as this next slide illustrates, leaders are challenged to think simultaneously. How do I build a cheaper, better, faster horse and imagine the car? Next slide. The key message here is that it's not easy to be digital. Please click twice so the whole slide shows. And what's important to highlight is that digital transformation is not straightforward. Compared to previous forms of transformation, where about 12% of efforts achieved or exceeded the expectations that were set, with respect to digital, we're seeing that only 5% achieved or exceeded the expectations, while 71% settled for dilution of value and mediocre performance. So preparation is critical. Next slide. In terms of preparing to take advantage for the fourth industrial revolution, the World Economic Forum has been collaborating with the Bain and Company to help develop a framework to think about all the topics related to digital transformation and the tough questions that everyone needs to think about. These cover 4 main topics: digital strategy, business model, enablers, and orchestration. I won't go into the details. We'll make sure the slides are available, but just to highlight the comprehensive approach and thinking that needs to happen. Moving on to the third area, investing in leading transformation. Next slide. So here are a couple of examples of how different entities are leading in digital transformation. This slide illustrates the transformation that Netflix has been undergoing to change the underlying economics of its business, starting with paper rental in 1998 to online subscription around 1999, and 2017 had moved to streaming and original content. Next slide. This next slide illustrates the quantum of investment that you need to make if you want to go big. General Motors has invested big in the automotive vehicle industry in terms of its strategy, but the total cost of this has amounted to over $2 billion. So again, it's not just complex, but it can also be very expensive to invest heavily in the fourth industrial revolution. Next slide. This slide illustrates a city approach, so more from the public policy, about adopting smart city technologies and integrating the fourth industrial revolution. In New York City, location sensors were first added to buses to help track delays. Please hold the previous slide. And with the adoption of 4IR, essentially they have managed to improve commuting time, which has decreased by 20%, and decreased traffic congestion and the negative environmental impact. Next slide. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, we are also seeing new solutions emerge through the adoption of the Internet of Things, and it is likely that IoT will be the single largest contributor to increased GDP in terms of the use cases with respect to the SDGs. Next slide. So this fourth key area is working together to face collective risks. At the World Economic Forum, we have a Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, as well as centers around the world focused on technology governance. We also have a Center for Cybersecurity, where we're working with, among others, Interpol. There are risks with respect to the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and there's a need for all stakeholders to work together about how we reposition ourselves with respect to crime in the digital space. Next slide. We're also working with industries to help them think about how boards as well as management needs to transform itself, and we have some thought leadership already about principles and tools to help boards prepare their organizations for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I mentioned the center in San Francisco. We're focused on about 9 technologies and are working both with policymakers as well as with companies on these new technologies and the protocols. We also have noted that sectors need to work together. It's not just an ICT thing. 4IR is disrupting everyone, and there's a need for collective effort to think differently about the skills, most importantly, that will be needed to be successful in this new era. Next slide. So lastly, ensuring that innovation is relevant to all citizens is critical. No one should be left behind. Next slide. Here's a quotation from Madeleine Albright, who noted, "People are talking to governments on 21st century technology. The government hears them on 20th century technology and responds with 19th century ideas." Governance matters. And why do we care about governance? 1, it's about distribution. We need equity in society. 2, it's about externalities. I've mentioned some of the risks associated with the technology. And 3 is intrinsic shifts. The next key message is that principles matter. We're talking about systems, not technologies. Empowering, not determining. By design, not default. Values as a feature, not a bug. The first step to overcoming challenges and addressing risks is thinking about principles to guide an approach to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's not about focusing on technologies. And lastly, in order to move forward, we need leadership in 4 key areas: technology, governance, values, and systems. We're living in an increasingly complex world. We need to deepen our understanding of its challenges, needs, and how to create a positive impact that propagates across multiple stakeholder groups. Thank you for your attention and the patience with the technology.
Can we give Dr. Elsie another round of applause? I am pretty sure your last set of slides were speaking to many of us, the things that we need to pay attention to. And that can only happen if we focus with purpose to make sure that these technologies, we're not just talking about them, but they come to life. And thank you for being agile, that when the technology failed, you resorted to what we know very best. Like the old rule, when your computer is not working very well, reboot. When technology fails, go to what you know works very well. We now go into the panel session. And Noah, I'd like to invite you up to the podium. You have about 30 minutes to have your conversation. I know you had about 45 minutes. But the person driving this car, there's a likelihood that in the next 5 minutes it may be at the Central Police Station. UAR 744J. And if you don't know the make of your car, it's a BMW. So please move Otherwise, when it is at the police, I will say, I told you. No.
Right Honorable Prime Minister of the Republic of Uganda, Your Excellency the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, ministers, cabinet members, ladies and gentlemen, the fourth industrial revolution is here. In a quick chat I was having outside with the Honorable Minister for Finance, he kept asking, why are you saying preparing, preparing? It is here. The technologies we are talking about are here. And so now how do we make sense of them? How do we move forward as a continent, as a country? Artificial intelligence has decentralized. It has disrupted life as we know it. Anyone with a smartphone has an artificial intelligence app on it. Big data is being used for decision making, not only at government level, but at private sector level. In some organizations, decisions can't be made unless they are data-driven. When we talk about robotics, manufacturing has revolutionized how we manufacture goods. Name it, there's a robot that's somewhere that is used to prepare it, to create it. When you talk about drones, drones are also starting to get into the mainstream in finding applications in agriculture, entertainment, and even in the health industry, with companies like Zipline that are using drones to deliver drugs and blood into hard-to-reach areas. Talking about 3D printing, we just saw a headline a few days ago where doctors in South Africa made the first transplant of an inner ear that was 3D printed. When we talk about blockchain, we are seeing a revolution around all over the world when we talk about supply chains and how blockchain is being used to revolutionize supply chains. In the financial sector, the application of blockchain in terms of cryptocurrencies is causing mainstream attention. To mention but a few, JP Morgan, one of the world's largest banks, recently announced its own cryptocurrency to settle in its bond markets. Ripple, the third largest cryptocurrency in the world, just bought stake in MoneyGram. Not to mention what happened most recently when Facebook announced its own cryptocurrency. That sent the world buzzing because Facebook has 2.7 billion users. Imagine giving that financial power to 2.7 billion users. Ladies and gentlemen, the fourth industrial revolution is here. And we, as Africa, how are we responding? As a continent, how are we positioning ourselves? And to discuss this I don't think of a more able panel, and I'm going to invite Dr. Elsie Kanza to come and join me up here. Let's give her a hand.
Elsie Kanza. Elsie is the head of Africa at the World Economic Forum. She was named one of Forbes' 20 youngest power women in Africa in 2011. And is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader for 2011 and an Archbishop Desmond Tutu Leadership Fellow for 2008.
I'm going to invite back Professor Charles Kwesiga to come up to the panel.
Professor Charles Kwesiga. Professor Kwesiga is the Executive Director of Uganda Industrial Research Institute. An industrial engineer by profession, he has significant experience as a corporate manager, management consultant, educator, and entrepreneur.
I'm going to invite a vibrant young entrepreneur, Edgar Kasenene, to come up to the podium.
Companies. He has more than 28 years of professional experience in the ICT sector and has spent the last 3 years working with emerging technologies and innovation roles across Africa with the aim of helping leading companies navigate this new digital era.
I'm going to invite Mr. Ubuntu Coin, Mamadou Toure, over here to the podium. Is Mamadou here? So that was a surprise. I don't think he knew about it here. But finally, I'm going to invite Mohamed Tassir over to the podium. Let's give him a hand.
Mohammed Tayzir. Mohammed is a certified blockchain instructor and solutions architect, business strategist, and angel investor and entrepreneur. He is currently the CEO of Dracon Tech Solutions, a company that offers digital transformation management, training and solutions development in the UAE and Egypt, as well as the business lead at Flare, a new consensus and protocol network.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our panel. I'm just going to join them and then we'll start. So I'll start with Professor. In your remarks, you said that industrialization involves the conversion of raw material into goods that we can use. So it is argued that in the fourth industrial revolution, data is the new raw material. What do you have to say for that?
Yes, data, of course, is a key raw material because it guides and governs everything. But we still have to deal with the physical aspect. When you are in a room like this, data will not create chairs and tables. You need the physical aspect of life. And so it's important that we move from subsistence, from providing basic needs. Technology must be the physical aspects of technology must be addressed. Then when we talk about robots, I'm glad you talked about the drone earlier on. I had a very interesting experience. Some hobbyist was playing around with a robot, with a drone, which got stuck in a tree at my campus where I work. The police response was most interesting because they came with bulletproof vests ready to arrest this technology because they were really scared, which makes it important that awareness, educating our citizens about these technologies, explaining what they are about. I heard a story about a banker earlier on. And so, while definitionally we can talk about what big data, what blockchains are, and Internet of Things, yes, all that is data, but data must be a component of the whole process, including the physical aspects of technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Edgar, they say Africa is behind. They say that the only solution we have is to leapfrog. How realistic is this expectation?
Thank you, Noel. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. But before I answer that question, I think it's important to unpack a few things. And forgive me, I do get passionate about this topic because it's actually very important. We will come to the Africa conversation in a couple of minutes, but I think this is one of the most strategically important discussions for many reasons, and I think Dr. Kanza's presentation, unfortunately it was rushed, was probably trying to liberate it the most. I don't really like the term, and we see this in our world, in the software world, and especially spending about 2 years heading up innovation and IoT for Ericsson in Africa. We see the massive changes in society have completely changed every single domain and every single industry as we know it, but they're not intuitive to us because unfortunately society purposed us for the industrial era. They purposed us to get physical jobs. They purposed us to work in specific domain expertise, and what you started to see with the internet is that those boundaries started to disappear. So if I take us back a few steps, I think the logical way to look at it, to start to see how massively different the world is go back to us as human beings. Our source of relevance was our domain expertise. We went to school and studied for X amount of years. and got a degree in a certain space, and information was so scarce that you were the expert in that area. And what started to happen with the internet is that the internet has democratized information. So everything that you know today, somebody can click a few times and understand that. And so we're living in a world where your domain expertise, which brought you to this table, is no longer unique to you, and is no longer unique to you to create, which completely starts to disrupt the substrate as we know it. If you then add on top of that the fact that the internet-born companies, and this is why it wasn't a chance, but that Dr. Kanza showed that 80% of the value is technology companies that are born in the internet era, because they didn't grow up in the same boundaries, so they create value exponentially. But if you add the fact that mobility and cloud services, together with AI and machine learning, meant that we typically, any modern person here is consuming every single application here. It's completely disrupted traditional models of businesses and information. I was sitting on a table and everybody on my table had a smartphone. Everybody was on WhatsApp and Netflix and YouTube and whatever you want to call it. But we spend 90% of our lives on applications that don't exist in our geographical area or just don't exist in our domain expertise. And what people are not seeing is that that's really disrupting the old industries. You combine the internet with accelerating technology, you have a new world where value is created exponentially. And I'll touch on that in regards to Africa because this gives us a unique opportunity, specifically to Uganda. Uganda, the average age is 16. We're a digital nation, 80% under 30. These people are born in the internet era, and we'll talk about what we can do to leverage that. But why I give these examples is that none of the substrates that brought us here are going to take us forward. Let me elaborate on that in terms of like pure physical examples. This morning I had breakfast with Robert Kapshenga. We're discussing some initiatives with him. If I asked anybody in this audience if they bought a newspaper today, or when was the last time you bought a newspaper? Last year alone, Vision Group lost 50% of their sales because we get news from WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram, on WhatsApp chat groups. So in real time, we're no longer buying newspapers, and I'll explain why they have that example. But that means that Vision Group as an entity cannot exist for another year. Because if you buy newspapers, that means their sales are going down. If you're not buying newspapers, and if they lost 50% in 6 months, in another 6 months they've lost another 50%. And that's not going to slow down because the younger generation is certainly not going to buy newspapers. But that means digital is not a buzzword. It's important for Vision Group to use their brand loyalty to get onto the device that I am on because I still need the news. But I'm not going to buy a physical newspaper. So my business model is not selling a newspaper. It is creating a digital solution that will help a modern user consume the news. Let's talk about banking. And we're also engaging with a few banks here. In South Africa, I haven't been into my branch for 5 years. Last year I had the privilege, and Candy is in the audience, to engage with Stanbic Bank. I met the CEO, I met the executives, we've been meeting a few of them. And part of the conversations they asked me is, what should we do about the future? And I said, go into all your bank branches today, that was in October last year, and reskill those people because we're in a digital way of consuming. So bank branches, a physical presence, the touch points are irrelevant. So when Standard Bank in South Africa in March this year announced that they're closing 150 branches and letting go 2,000 people, it was a shock to the government. But society no longer physically goes into a branch. So our behavior has changed the model. And so if Standard Bank had started reskilling, those 2,000 people that they're letting go from the branch would not be shocked. And the CEO had to say, look, I'm going to give you packages so that you can invest in startups. Because that bank branch job is no longer a relevant job. And World Economic Forum can give you statistics. 30% of any domain expertise that you have here in the next 2 years will be relevant. Not because it's bad, but because technology simplifies our world lives, makes access to information easier, and changes the way we produce and consume. So if I can borrow money from my Barclays Bank app here, and I wouldn't show you the example, I can borrow £50,000 in 2 minutes without speaking to anybody. The reality is this is only possible because I can use AI and machine learning to understand my transactions. But that also means that I don't need a whole bunch of technology or credit officers. A software developer who is running an algorithm on my banking transaction is a more relevant skill. And yet we don't talk about these things. We use the experiences and we use the technologies, and they change our lives. And by the way, this is not going to slow down, but we don't relate it to how it has completely disrupted every single domain as you see it. Bring that back to Africa because there's so much more we can say, but we'll unpack it tomorrow in the keynote I have about the digital era and the future of work. But bring it back to Africa is that having worked 14 years in a multinational, Ericsson, one of the leading telecommunications companies, I am more passionate about Africa than anything because you start to see how in a lot of these multinationals, They have a lot of good solutions, but they are invested in the growth of their own areas. Specifically to Africa, as I went through the years in Ericsson, you start to see that technology means that we can take massive leaps. Today, we're not at a competitive disadvantage because everything a child in Silicon Valley can do, I can do. So in Retro Rabbit, when we engage in Uganda and solve a problem for a company, and by the way, we're recruiting Andela people, you should join Retro. We don't use proprietary software. We use Google, open source software to solve problems. This is accessible to everybody. And I'm not going to give away trade secrets, but if I go to Stanbic Bank and I build them a digital platform, I can go back to South Africa, use Google, open source software, create that solution that digitally that person is going to use, and change the substrate. So today in Africa, there are no excuses. The internet is available to everybody, and we'll talk about some of the things we can accelerate. The open source software tools are available to everybody. If we add, only thing we need to add is structure the policy where we understand that digital highways are today as important as physical highways. That internet access for a child at school is more important than putting a teacher. We put policy that digital startups get funding. These are the guys who create the future. And for Africa, and I see it in our company because it's full of 22 and 24 years old, they're hungry, they're smart, they have all the tools, they just want the platform. We are not behind.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Edgar. So, Mohammed, you are a blockchain developer, and blockchain is such a buzzword. But you're also from Egypt, so I would just like to say on behalf of Uganda, we forgive you.
And I'm going to say good luck next time.
Yeah, but what do you have to say when it comes to bringing together blockchain? Because it's a buzzword and it's saying Africa is the next frontier, but what tangibly is on ground? Because we talked about the theory last year, what's the tangible on ground?
Well, the tangible on the ground is still being built because we still have to remember that the blockchain industry itself, Bitcoin has been there since 2009, but the actual industry started in 2015 with the launch of Ethereum and Hyperledger and the beginning of starting to use smart contracts to build applications and decentralized applications running on top of blockchain, which we're talking about today on creating supply chain solutions, creating identity management solutions, financial solutions, and other things as well, because it adds the value of having something like a smart contract, which is similar to a contract. It's a very old concept, by the way. It was, I think if I remember correctly, during the 80s. And it's the idea of having a contract that is binding between two people, that is not done by a legal entity, but it's code. So you trust the code, you trust the math, that whenever it's an actionable event, whenever you have something that needs to be done, it's done that way. So for financial institutions, it can act as a substitute to letter of guarantee, LCs, LGs, it can act as a wallet, it can act as anything. A smart contract can be an actionable thing by itself. So blockchain is not a buzzword as in like it's something new, it's a new tool. And when we talk about regulating blockchain, I wouldn't say we should regulate blockchain, we should regulate the uses on how to use blockchain. Because when we look at a hammer can be used to build something and it can be used to kill someone. And it's the law that tells you what you can use the hammer for because it's a tool in your hand. Blockchain is a new tool for developers to start building new things on top of networks that weren't available before in new ways. And that's what blockchain is. What it can do for the future, and Africa, definitely a lot of things, including financial inclusion, and personal information management, medical records, talking about land registry, we're talking about government level, like governance as well, changing the way the community interacts with each other, creating new business models where you have the community and the owners of the business partnering together, where you don't have to worry about the cost of having accountants and lawyers to kind of like keep track of who's who and what's what. And basically having done all of that through complete immutable trackability on top of a blockchain creates a new value for businesses, even for startups, even during the craze of the ICOs. Aside from all the bad negativity that came out of ICOs, but it showed the world a new value in how you can fund a project. Crowdfunding taken to a whole new level, having startups being listed and exchanged on exchanges similar to large companies and being able to go through with their investments, create stuff, and to move forward. So in Africa, I believe that we're not behind. We actually have a golden opportunity today. We have we don't have the old traditional infrastructure per se, which gives us a clean slate where we can begin cleanly building for the infrastructure of the next 25 years, preparing our children and our labor force for the next 25 years. Projects like, I'm part of also the Hyperloop Transportation Technologies company, and our business model is built upon collaboration and working together. If we can bring something like this and create a workforce that we can have and talk and create something in collaborative mentality, it will be a true Pan-African initiative, because we need that. And we have the ability to do that. We have the skills to do that. People like in South Africa, they have amazing software developers. In Egypt as well. They just
buy them from Uganda.
And also in Africa, everywhere. We have in Nigeria, Kenya, people are turning towards that because they're trying to find a way to reinvent themselves and be relevant to this world. So we have to, like for policymakers, they need to push that into creating programs, creating things that can push forward education and to push forward real partnerships between educational facilities, private sector, public sector, and working together in unison, essentially.
Thank you. Mamadou, you talked about the Ubuntu coin and we as Africans uniting around an independent financial system. In 2 minutes, what is the vision of Ubuntu coin in moving Africa towards embracing fourth industrial revolution?
Yes, thank you. The vision of Ubuntu coin is very simple, is help provide the financial means to the African continent to leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution. And how do we do that? We go back to what Africa has the most precious and most valuable, which is its natural resources that the whole world is scrambling for. But this time we make it a currency, leveraging on blockchain. And as you do that, you lift people out of poverty because they don't have paper to trade. They have an effective asset, and an asset that appreciates every year. If you take gold, it has appreciated 10% on average per year over the past 40 years, right? So if Africa was trading in Ubuntu coin since, let's say, the 70s, Africa will be 5 to 7 times richer today, right? Now, what is critical too is what it allows, decentralized finance. This is very important because, I mean, I'm a former World Bank group investment officer, and so far, money has been centralized. If you give the opportunity to people in Africa to have access to capital, going way beyond what banks can provide by decentralizing that access and by using an effective currency that appreciates, first you create peer-to-peer lending. Remember, as a fundamental thing, Africa has what you call stokvels or tontine, where it's a community financing mechanism. If you start doing that, even for agriculture, where farmers can and people in the city can support one another and fund each other, and also get the 7 billion people to become financiers of this other 7 billion people, then you start having a whole new world emerging.
Thank you. Last but not least.
Can I say something adding to what Tori was saying, is that the idea of coming together and financing each other is the real power of what blockchain can do for a lot of people, and the funding of community-led projects, where all the community are partners so that the success of this project is part of the success of the community as well. And it feeds back into that as a loop.
Great. Elsie, Agenda 2063 talks about a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. An integrated continent politically united based on the ideals of a Pan-Africanism and the vision of African Renaissance, a Wakanda of sorts. Aspiration 7, an Africa as strong, united, resilient, influential global player and partner. When we're bringing all these conversations together in an Africa 4.0 initiative, how do you see us moving? Are we going to succeed if we come together? Must we succeed? As in, what is your view in pulling a Pan-African move in embracing technology?
Thank you for the question. Good question, because that is my responsibility at the forum, and I have many of my bosses here, because my team in particular manages relationships with governments. Let me start off with the good news. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that we are seeing examples of adoption of the fourth industrial revolution that is providing use cases to help other countries that are lagging behind to catch up. So if I may, Uganda in a global ranking for cybersecurity is ranked at number 44 globally. South Africa is at about 90. There's a lot we could learn from Uganda in that respect. Why are you the environment for doing business, just speeding up the processing of the supply chain with respect to logistics. In Sierra Leone, recently we published an article of how they've adopted 3D, a very innovative approach, and using it to help shape conversations around education reforms and policy, which globally we're getting feedback on because they hadn't seen that before. With Rwanda in leadership, Africa is leading at the forum in terms of the civilian use of drones. We started with Rwanda as a case study. Last year we had a Pan-African gathering of civil aviation authorities as well as the technologists, and now we're taking that forward. So globally, Africa is leading in how to develop the protocol and regulatory frameworks to support this. The bad news is that according to the recently published 2018 UN report on e-governance, and I'm looking at my sister from the UN, Africa is lagging behind the rest of the world. According to the e-government development index, Africa's average is on the rise. This is good news. We're improving. But it is still lower than all the other continents, standing at 0.3433. Europe has the world's highest average at 0.7727. How do we catch up? Only 6 African countries belong to the group of states with a high level of e-know-how: Ghana, Mauritius, Morocco, Seychelles, South Africa, and Tunisia. 6. We have to close the gap with respect to those that are missing. The challenge in doing this is that as much as we speak of those on smartphones, the reality is 4 billion people around the world are still not connected to the digital economy. And Africa is a big part of that. Unless we bring them on board, then we're speaking to a minority, and it is difficult. We have an Internet for All initiative that we've been running in pilot with South Africa and Rwanda for the past 2 years. And even with the different projects, I can tell you, practically speaking, it's easy to speak about and harder to implement. And to make it worse, globally, what we're also seeing is a deterioration of trust in institutions. You saw an example earlier as I struggled with the technology. Why should you trust it if it is not foolproof? Last evening, we were struggling to share the presentation with the team here. And I don't know if you know that there was an outage globally. This was CompuFlare, I believe, for 2 hours. But it slowed everything down. I was in Kampala trying to send something to somebody in the same hotel, influenced by something happening in America. So even for those who are connected, we're seeing that only 45% believe the digital economy will benefit everyone in society. 43% believe society has become more unequal, and 55% believe that not enough is being done to ensure that technology benefits everyone. So this is a report that we published towards the end of last year about digital trust. And I'd just like to reinforce what the first speaker said, that in so much as we are in this fourth industrial revolution era, we should not forget that the foundation is very basic in terms of infrastructure. No energy, no connectivity, no trust, nobody will use it, even if they have access to it. If it's not affordable and it's not relevant, and you don't have the skills, then there's no difference that can be made.
Thank you very much, Elsie. We're running out of time. So what I'm hearing from the panel here is that as Africans, as in the spirit of Ubuntu, we must hold hands, work together in lifting us up from the disparity that we have in terms of embracing technology and hold each other. And that's the heart behind the Africa 4.0 initiative, which is one thing that we are announcing here. It is an idea, a thought that brings together African countries to understand what unique advantages do these technologies present. And in the words of His Excellency, the President of Uganda, how do we domesticate these technologies to be relevant to everyone, including the high percentage of Africans that are in the rural areas, don't have connectivity and even just getting access to power. And so as the Africa Initiative, what we are saying, we are pledging to hold hands. And we've already thanked organizations like World Economic Forum, Africa Peer Review Mechanism, the likes of MTN, and many other organizations that are signing on saying that they will play their part in spreading this news. And also together with the partnerships that the bridges that we are creating between Uganda and Sierra Leone, working towards getting us to understand these technologies and to embrace them, and more importantly, to innovate them, to even innovate on them. In an article I wrote recently, one of the things that we noticed is that Africa, we are creating the biggest free trade area in the world. This is at a scale that has not been seen. The next 1 billion people are going to be coming from Africa. But if we are going to be an Africa that is strong, united, and resilient, a global player, what is that platform? In the age of Amazon and Alibaba, how are we going to trade as Africa? How do we secure a seat at that economic table? Africa is going to be at that economic table. It is up to us to decide whether we are going to be seated at that table or on the menu. And with that, I close, and we thank this panel. The members of this panel are going to be around throughout these 2 days, and they're going to be running sessions, and so we're going to be deep diving into some of these topics. I'd also like to take this opportunity to bring apologies from Dr. Bitang Ndemo, who unfortunately couldn't make it because of the sudden demise of the Safaricom CEO that happened unfortunately yesterday, the day before, and they were close, and so he asked that we convey his apologies. Over to the MC. Thank you very much.
Deserve a round of applause, don't they? When I was growing up, I lived with my grandmother. And every time a visitor or a special guest came from afar, she would be so happy. She would ululate, she would dance around the house, and of course she would prepare a special meal for the guest. But what sticks in my mind is she would say welcome. She would welcome this special guest as many times and for as long as the guest is still in the house. So, Your Excellency, please don't get tired of our warm welcomes. And this time, I'm welcoming you in a very special language. Una welcome to Kampala and to Uganda. The previous speakers have said so much, and obviously I'm not going back into that, but something sticks out again. How much should I disrupt myself? We know blockchain is here to stay. How much should you disrupt yourself? That's a question that I think each of us should ask ourselves. And going forward, may you now allow me to welcome, I'm not in any place to invite our special guests to speak today. Allow me to invite the Honorable State Minister for Planning, Honorable David Bahati, to come and speak to us, and also invite our next speakers. You're welcome, Honorable.
Your Excellency, the Right Honorable Prime Minister, the Right Honorable former Prime Minister of Uganda, members of Cabinet, I wish to extend a special welcome to His Excellency, the President
conference. We have people who have traveled from across the continent and even beyond, and they are here in this conference. I want to take this privilege to welcome them by appreciating them. Please join me in appreciating those that have come from across the continent and beyond. And please spare some time 2 days after the conference and visit our wonderful country. South of the country, we have mountain gorillas, 16 families, the largest family in the world. We also have the source of the Nile, a few minutes from here, 45 minutes from Kampala, and the national parks across the country. It's a beautiful country, it's a pearl of Africa, and you are all welcome to visit our country. With that disruption, I beg to make 2 points before I invite the Right Honorable Prime Minister. That technology is the present and the future. Earlier on, I was discussing with the organizers. They were saying, as Africa prepares for this fourth industrial revolution, we are not about to prepare or we are preparing. Actually, what we need to do is to embrace the fourth industrial revolution. It's already here. If we don't embrace it, it will disrupt us. And if it disrupts us, we shall not wait to be disrupted. It will leave us behind. So it is the future. It is the present. Your Excellency, I want to give you an example. A few years ago, we introduced mobile money, the transfer of money, banking using mobile money. And the banks were hesitant, and people of Uganda were hesitant to embrace it. But as we speak, in a GDP economy of 109 trillion, which is roughly 27.8 billion US dollars, mobile money transactions account to 80 trillion, close to 15 billion US dollars. Is what we're talking about here in blockchain conference. Africa was unfortunate that we were left out, as Professor Kwesiga talked about it, in the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. We were disadvantaged. But in the fourth revolution, we have no excuse whatsoever to be left out. Key important points in the fourth revolution. 1, internet. All of us access internet. Second, if you talk about the blockchain revolution, it's about trust and consensus. And I think Africa, we trust more than the rest of the world. So let's embrace this revolution. Let's work together to make sure that we take advantage of this to grow our economy and grow the economy of Africa. Kwame, the organizer, disrupted our speech